Marcus was still holding his phone when he walked into our bedroom, not even looking at me as I struggled to shift position against the pillows. The surgical brace wrapped around my lower back made every movement feel like negotiating with my own body. And the bruise on my left hand from the IV line was turning that ugly yellow-green color that marks the tail end of an injury. I could feel it coming, something in the way he was standing in the doorway, arms already half-crossed before he said a word, but nothing prepared me for the casual brutality of it. This Saturday, 12 members of my family are staying with us for 2 weeks. Have everything prepared. No discussion. No question mark at the end. Just a statement, dropped like a suitcase into the silence of our bedroom, and I remember actually laughing because I thought it was a joke. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't joking. That's the moment everything shifted, and I couldn't tell you exactly why, except that I was lying in a bed, still healing from someone cutting through layers of muscle and bone, and my husband had just decided our house would become a full-service hotel without asking if I could possibly survive it. 5 days. That's how long it had been since Dr. Patterson wheeled me out of surgery and told me in that flat voice doctors use when they want you to listen carefully. You need a minimum of 4 weeks without lifting anything heavier than a gallon of milk. No standing longer than 15 minutes at a stretch. Stairs once or twice daily maximum. Here's your restriction sheet. Keep it somewhere you'll see it. The papers were still folded in my nightstand drawer, next to the bottle of oxycodone I was trying desperately not to depend on, even though some days the pain was the only honest thing in my body. Marcus. I kept my voice level because I learned years ago that raising it never actually got me anywhere with him. He would just wait it out until I exhausted myself arguing. I just had surgery. Please, can we postpone this until next week? Even a few days would help. He didn't even glance up from his phone. No one is waiting. Those 4 words landed somewhere I didn't expect them to land. Not in my chest where I thought hurt was supposed to live, but lower, in that tender place in your stomach where you feel something curdle, something turn, something you can't quite take back. 22 years of marriage. And he had never spoken to me quite like that before, not with that specific coldness, like I was an employee asking for a day off during busy season and he was simply informing me my request was denied. I didn't argue. That's not who I am when things matter most. I need time to turn things over, to look at them from every angle, before I know what I actually think. So I just nodded, and he left the room satisfied, already texting someone his mother, probably, I thought with arrival details I hadn't agreed to. That night, I lay awake long after Marcus's breathing evened out beside me. The ceiling fan above our bed turned slowly, catching the blue light from the street lamp outside our window, and my back ached in that deep structural way that reminded me I was still healing from something serious. Something that required a surgeon to cut through muscle and tendon to reach bone and fix what was broken there. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself actually think about the last 2 decades, instead of just living through them like they were something happening to me rather than something I was doing. Every single summer. Without fail. Like clockwork. Marcus's family would descend on our house like a cheerful, well-intentioned army. His parents David and Patricia, who'd been married 50 years and had strong opinions about everything from how I organized my refrigerator to how I seasoned the roast. His brother James, who said more than once, usually after his 3rd beer, that the house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a small erasure of the fact that I had grown up in this very home, in the room that later became Trinity's nursery, then her bedroom, then eventually the guest room where Patricia slept every summer. James's wife and their 2 teenage kids. Marcus's younger sister Sophie and her husband. Their toddler, who was admittedly adorable, but also meant I spent 2 full weeks cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs and pretending it was a privilege. 12 people for 14 days every single summer since Marcus and I got married. I never sat down and did the actual math until about 6 years ago, and I stopped counting when the total hours started to feel like an accusation against my own choices. I bought groceries from a very specific list because Patricia didn't eat gluten, and David insisted on avoiding anything spicy since his cholesterol appointment, and the teenagers apparently required a constant supply of a particular expensive brand of string cheese that only one store in town carried. I made up the guest room beds with fresh sheets, blew up air mattresses for the overflow, and washed what felt like mountains of laundry towels and sheets that smelled like other people's homes, other people's detergent. I drove to the airport. I planned the meals. I smiled in photographs where I was always the one standing slightly outside the frame. The one who'd just excused herself to check on something cooking. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if I was tired. Not once had anyone asked whether the timing worked for me, or whether I wanted a summer that didn't revolve entirely around invisible service. It had simply always worked, because I had simply always made it work. The way water finds the lowest point and settles there without complaint. I thought about Trinity. Away at college now, probably asleep in some dorm room 3 states away, completely unaware that her mother was lying in the dark in a pain brace doing arithmetic on her own exhaustion. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself in the hospital recovery room, groggy and floating from anesthesia, when I'd sworn to myself that this surgery, this concrete, documented injury would finally be the thing that slowed me down. That forced me to protect myself the way I'd spent 2 decades protecting everyone else. And yet here was my husband, announcing that the family visit would proceed exactly as planned, as though my body's breakdown didn't actually change anything. I reached for the pain medication on the nightstand, shook out 1 pill, then set the bottle back down without taking it. I needed my head clear. Instead, I reached past it for my laptop, the screen throwing pale light across the blanket and the brace still cinched tight around my middle. I wasn't checking recipes. I wasn't planning menus or comparing hotel cribs for the baby. For the first time in my marriage, I opened the folder containing the deed to our house. The very document that changed everything I thought I understood about my own home. The house came to my parents in 1982 when they bought it together, and I grew up in these rooms, played in the backyard, carved my initials into the back fence. When my father died 8 years ago, and my mother 2 years after that, the house came to me. Not to me and Marcus jointly, to me. I remember signing papers at the lawyer's office. Remember Marcus sitting beside me that day, distracted, checking his phone saying, "That's great, honey," without really looking up. He'd never asked to see the deed after that day. It simply never occurred to him to ask. In his mind, from the moment we moved our furniture back into my childhood home, it became our house, our home, our property, our place to open to whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift from my to our, my ownership seemed to dissolve into something communal, something he felt entitled to give away to his family without asking me first. I read every page twice that night, sitting on the closed toilet in the hallway bathroom with my laptop balanced on my knees, because bending my spine still sent sharp signals down my legs. The language was plain, almost shocking in its clarity. Sole owner. My name printed beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. And I sat there at 1 a.m, knees pulled up awkwardly, understanding finally that this house, the place where I'd played as a child, grieved my parents, built a life legally belonged to me entirely. Just me. The thought settled something in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something steadier than anger. Clarity. The next morning, after Marcus left for work, I called Christine Foster, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she remembered me immediately. Remembered the jar of homemade jam I'd brought to her office out of gratitude after everything was settled. I told her everything, the surgery, the restrictions, the 12 relatives arriving in 4 days, Marcus's complete refusal to even consider waiting a few more weeks. I told her about the way he'd said it, like a weather report. She listened without interrupting. The way good lawyers do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point I was actually trying to make, without quite knowing how to say it. "Whose name is on the deed?" she asked finally. "Mine. Just mine." "Then legally, you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Your husband doesn't need to co-sign a decision about your own home. You're not asking permission. You're informing him." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the unfamiliar weight of authority. "I don't want to hurt him," I said. And I meant it with a part of my heart that hadn't stopped loving him even though I was beginning to understand he'd stopped seeing me. Whatever else was true, Marcus was still the person I'd chosen, the father of my daughter, the man I'd built a life with. I just didn't know anymore if he'd ever actually looked at me. "This isn't about hurting anyone," Christine said, and her voice softened in a way that told me she'd had this conversation with other women before. "Maybe many times. You had major surgery 5 days ago. Your surgeon gave you explicit restrictions. You are not obligated to host anyone, family or otherwise, while you're in recovery. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, Rachel. It's the bare minimum of taking care of yourself. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty. I wrote it on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my laptop where I'd see it every time I opened the screen. We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, about what I could legally do, about documentation and clean communication, and how to handle things without leaving room for anyone to claim I'd acted out of spite or revenge. Christine was careful about that. Paper trail, she kept saying. Everything in writing. Everything defensible. I appreciated that she never once asked me to reconsider, never once suggested I was overreacting. She treated my exhaustion like a fact, not a feeling that needed to be managed by someone else. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out at the backyard where David always set up his folding chair in the one patch of shade, where Patricia liked to inspect my flower beds and offer unsolicited advice about mulch and fertilizer, and which plants I was clearly not taking good care of. I thought about the physical therapy appointments already on the calendar for the weeks ahead. I thought about the simple fact that I could barely carry a laundry basket without wincing, let alone cook 3 meals a day for 12 people while my body was still learning to function again. I want to be honest about something, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story like I sat there scheming, rubbing my hands together like some cartoon villain plotting her revenge. That wasn't it at all. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was tired, and I was scared of my own body's limits for maybe the first time in my adult life. And I was starting, very slowly, to understand that this house, the one I'd grown up in, the one my father had left specifically to me, didn't have to be the place where I disappeared into service every summer. Didn't have to be the place where I lost myself. I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began making a list. Not a grocery list. Not a cleaning schedule. A plan. By Thursday afternoon, I had 3 phone calls scheduled, and I made every single one of them from inside my car, parked in the lot of the pharmacy 2 miles from the house. My seat was reclined just enough to keep the pressure off my lower back. I didn't want Marcus walking past the door and overhearing. Not because I was hiding anything illegal. Christine had been very clear that everything I was about to do was well within my rights, but because I needed to finish building this before he had the chance to talk me out of it, the way he always managed to with that particular tone he used when he wanted something, and had decided my resistance was just a formality to be waited out. The first call was to a company called Miller's Complete Restoration, an interior renovation outfit that handled everything from water damage to full remodels. I told the woman on the phone, a brisk, efficient woman named Catherine, that I needed a full interior assessment and restoration, quote, flooring, paint, drywall work in the upstairs hallway where an old water stain had never quite been addressed. All of that was true. I'd been meaning to fix that stain for 2 years. Catherine said she could send a 3-person crew out Saturday morning at 8 o'clock and that the work would likely take 2 weeks given the scope. 2 weeks. Exactly the length of the family visit. I felt something in my chest unclench slightly at those words. The second call went to a heating and cooling company for an emergency inspection of the central air system, which actually had been making an odd rattling noise for about a month. I wasn't lying about that either. I was simply choosing, for the first time in my marriage, to prioritize my house's actual needs over my own exhaustion in the service of everyone else's comfort. The third call was to a painting company that Christine had recommended, one she said was reliable about honoring contract terms, including the standard clause about occupancy during active work, no residence on the premises during interior painting and floor refinishing, safety and liability reasons. That clause was the whole point. I had the representative read it back to me twice to make sure I understood every word. By Saturday morning, all 3 crews were scheduled to arrive between 8 and 9 o'clock. I'd already contacted my insurance company, who confirmed that under my recovery plan, I qualified for a short-term stay at a rehabilitation apartment complex about 15 minutes from the house, a place with grab bars in the bathroom, a single-level layout, a nurse who did wellness checks twice a week. I hadn't mentioned this option to Marcus because he hadn't asked. Not once in 5 days had he asked where I planned to actually recover while hosting 12 people. Not once. I packed a bag Friday night while Marcus was at his brother's house, presumably finalizing arrival logistics and details I hadn't agreed to and wasn't consulted about. I moved slowly, the brace creaking faintly with each motion, folding just enough clothes for 2 weeks, my medications, the folder with my post-surgical instructions, my laptop, and the framed photo of my parents that had sat on our dresser for years. Then I left a note on the kitchen counter. Not dramatic, just factual. Gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation work beginning Saturday. Contractors have keys. Please don't interfere with their schedule. It's a liability issue with insurance. And I drove myself to the rehab apartment Friday night, wincing every time I hit a pothole, and I slept better than I had in 5 days. I wasn't there to see what happened Saturday morning, but Marcus told me about it later. Told me in pieces in the weeks that followed. And I've stitched his account together with what Linda admitted eventually and what James let slip, and here's what I understand happened. 3 SUVs pulled into our driveway around 10 that morning, packed with suitcases, coolers, folding beach chairs, a cooler specifically for the seafood. James's wife insisted on bringing every year. 12 people spilled out onto the lawn, chattering already, discussing who'd sleep where, and they're taped to the front door at eye level, laminated, so it wouldn't curl in the Houston humidity were 2 printed signs. Home closed for renovation. No occupancy until further notice per contractor, and insurance requirements. Behind the signs, through the front windows, they could see the crew already inside. A man in coveralls sanding down the hallway floor. Plastic sheeting draped over the living room furniture. The unmistakable chemical smell of primer already seeping out through the screen door. Marcus later admitted he'd tried uselessly to pry the door open. Patricia's face changed first, then David's, according to what James told me. Marcus stood on the porch for what Patricia described as a very long time, just staring at the sign like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Catherine's crew foreman came to the door polite but firm and explained that the property was under an active service contract prohibiting occupancy during the work. Standard liability protocol, he said. Nothing personal, sir. Just company policy and the terms of the agreement. Marcus called me 4 times before I even turned my phone back on. When I finally did, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in my rehab apartment, I watched the missed call notifications stack up on the screen, one after another, like something building toward a wave. When I picked up on the 5th call, his voice came through sharp and clipped, none of the smoothness he usually carried like a second skin. What did you do? No greeting. No. How are you feeling? Just that accusation dropped on the table between us. I kept my voice level the way I'd practiced in my head more than once over the past few days. Exactly what my surgeon asked me to do, Marcus. I'm recovering from major surgery. I can't host 12 people right now. I told you that. You said no one was waiting. There was silence on the line. Then, Melissa, my parents are standing on the porch. My name is Rachel. Rachel. The children are asking why we can't go inside. Do you understand what you've done? I understand. I hired a licensed contractor to do work my house has needed for 2 years, I said quietly. I understand my insurance is covering my recovery housing. I understand I told you 5 days ago that I needed you to postpone this trip, and you told me no one was waiting. Another silence, longer this time. Then he hung up. Patricia called next, and I almost didn't answer, but some old habit of politeness, or maybe just curiosity about what she'd say, made me pick up. Her voice was tight with the particular fury of a woman used to getting her way through sheer persistence. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? We drove 6 hours. The children are exhausted. This is completely selfish of you, Rachel. Completely. She caught herself before finishing the word, but I heard it anyway. Heard the shape of it in her throat. The word she almost said. Each selfish. As if a woman 5 days out from spinal surgery, asking not to host a house full of relatives, was the height of selfishness, and not the years Patricia had spent accepting my labor as though it were simply weather, simply something that happened rather than something I was doing. Something I chose to do because I loved the people I lived with and wanted to take care of them, but it was my choice, and it should have been asked for, not assumed. I didn't argue with her. I'd learned over 2 decades that arguing with Patricia was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you gripped, the faster it slipped through. Instead, I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork. The surgeon's restrictions printed in bold at the bottom. No lifting over 10 pounds. No standing longer than 15 minutes. Minimum 4 weeks recovery. Then I texted simply, "This is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements. and I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and didn't look at it again that day. David's voicemail came through later that evening, his tone booming even through the phone's tiny speaker. Something about how I'd made the whole family look foolish. How a wife doesn't just disappear when her husband needs her. I listened to it once, then deleted it, and found that my hands weren't even shaking. I'd expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally set down a piece of furniture she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten her arms could ache from something other than that specific weight. Marcus, meanwhile, was navigating a crisis I'd spent 22 summers quietly managing without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. 12 people needed somewhere to sleep, and nothing was available at the Reasonable Inn on Route 9. There was a wedding that weekend, apparently. So Marcus ended up booking rooms at the Marriott near the interstate at rates. I later learned when he made the mistake of complaining about it within earshot of James, came to just under $4,000 for the full 2 weeks, not counting meals. I heard through fragments Marcus let slip in the days that followed how the week unfolded for him. He was the one who had to figure out, at 9 at night, what a family of 12 wanted for dinner, only to discover that David didn't like the Italian place Marcus had picked, and Patricia's stomach couldn't handle the Mexican restaurant James suggested as a compromise. The toddler needed a specific brand of crackers that wasn't sold at the gas station convenience store where Marcus ended up, exhausted at 10 p.m., searching the shelves. He was the one driving his parents to the pharmacy for David's blood pressure medication, which they'd forgotten. Driving James's teenagers to the outlet mall because they were bored. Fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves before he even noticed them as requests, because I had always resolved them first. I wasn't there to see any of it, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity because I'd lived it myself for 22 summers, invisible and unthanked. There was something almost meditative about not being the one solving it this time. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing the exercises my physical therapist had given me. Short, careful walks down the hallway, ice on my back in the evenings. Reading a novel I'd started 8 months ago and never finished because there was never quiet enough in my own house to hold a thought for longer than 10 minutes. On the third night, I lay on the narrow bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and I let myself feel for the first time without guilt, trailing behind it like a shadow, something close to peace. By the 5th day, something in Marcus's text started to shift. The first 2 days had been all accusation, capital letters, exclamation points, a barely restrained fury I recognized from the rare arguments we'd had over the years. But by Wednesday, the tone changed. Long day, he texted at 11 at night, no punctuation. No complaint attached to it, just those 2 flat words. Thursday. Mom wants steak for dinner, but Dad says no red meat since his cholesterol appointment. Can't win. I didn't respond to either. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I simply didn't have an answer for him yet, and I'd stopped believing it was my job to always have one. By the end of that first week, I heard from Trinity, who'd apparently gotten an earful from her grandmother about the whole situation, and called me sounding more amused than alarmed. "Mom," she said, laughing into the phone. "Grandma Patricia called me asking if I could talk some sense into you. I told her you just had spine surgery, and she should probably talk some sense into herself." I laughed too. The first real laugh I'd had in nearly a week. And something in my chest loosened at the sound of my daughter defending me without my even asking. Marcus called on the 6th day, and this time his voice sounded different, worn down at the edges, none of the sharpness from that first call. "The kids are cranky," he said. "Mom's complaining the hotel pillows are too firm. Dad wants to know why we can't just go stay at James's place instead, and James says his house isn't big enough, which, Rachel, it's not big enough for 4 people, let alone 12. But somehow our house was always supposed to be." He stopped himself like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud. "I've been doing the grocery runs every morning. Patricia has an opinion about literally every single item." He didn't finish the sentence. And I didn't finish it for him. That was the moment I opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for 15 years. The one I want to explain because it wasn't born out of bitterness. Not originally. I'd started it back when Trinity was in elementary school, mostly to track our household budget. Grocery costs, utility bills, the ordinary bookkeeping of a family trying to save for a daughter's college fund. But somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, I'd started logging the summer visits too. Not out of any grand plan. just the same instinct that made me keep receipts for everything else. Groceries during the 2-week visits, always noticeably higher than our normal weeks. The spike in water and electric bills every July. The cost of the air mattresses we'd replaced twice because the teenagers punctured them. The new mattress in the guest room after David's back trouble required something firmer. The rental car we'd covered 1 year when James's transmission gave out mid-visit, and he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. The airfare we'd quietly paid for Patricia and David 3 separate times when their retirement account, as David put it, was a little tight that year. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rehab apartment and added it all up, slowly, carefully. The way you'd count something you've been avoiding counting for a long time. The number that appeared at the bottom of the column made me sit back in my chair. $185,412, over 22 years. Groceries, utilities, repairs, mattresses, the rental car, the airfare. The endless small accommodations that had never once been reciprocated, never once even been acknowledged as a cost rather than an obligation, never once been thanked. I didn't cry, though I thought I might. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me, the same sensation I imagine a surgeon must feel studying an X-ray before an operation. Not anger exactly, but a kind of precise, unemotional clarity about the shape of the problem in front of her. I thought about Marcus's voice on the phone that afternoon, worn thin after less than a week of doing what I'd done for 2 decades without complaint. I thought about how quickly the family story about me selfish, ungrateful, difficult had assembled itself the moment I stopped absorbing the cost of their comfort. Nobody had asked what it cost me. Nobody had asked, not once in 22 years, whether I was tired, whether I was well, whether I wanted a summer that didn't revolve around service. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I began to think not about defending myself, but about being seen. Not through anger, through evidence. There's a particular kind of quiet a person carries when they've decided finally to stop explaining themselves and simply show the math instead. I spent the final days of my 2 weeks preparing something I'd never made before in my life, a presentation about my own marriage. It felt strange sitting at that small kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printer paper I'd bought at the drugstore down the street, formatting years of receipts and bank statements into something that could be read at a glance, the way you'd prepare a report for a boardroom rather than a family. But that's essentially what it had become. 22 years of unpaid, unacknowledged labor, laid out in black and white. I titled the cover page simply, 22 Years of Hospitality. Underneath in smaller text, $185,412. Then page by page, the breakdown. 2004 through this year. Groceries during summer visits itemized against our normal monthly averages. The spike in utilities every July circled in red. The replacement air mattresses. The guest room mattress. The rental car. The 3 years of airfare for Patricia and David. I included photographs too. Ones I'd taken over the years without any particular purpose beyond documentation. Patricia in the kitchen I'd stocked. David asleep in the recliner I'd bought, specifically because his back needed the support. The receipts themselves, scanned, dated, undeniable. I called Marcus on what would have been the last day of the visit and asked him to gather everyone at the house that evening. The renovation crew had finished 2 days early. The floors gleamed under new varnish. The hallway wall was finally free of its water stain. The air conditioning ran quiet, and even for the first time in months, he agreed, sounding cautious. Maybe even relieved that I was finally engaging again after 2 weeks of near silence. I arrived that evening still moving carefully, the brace loosened slightly now that I was further into recovery, and found all 12 of them gathered in the living room, perched on furniture that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I could see it on their faces immediately, the assumption worn openly that I'd come to apologize, to explain myself, maybe to cry a little and let them comfort me back into my old role. Patricia even stood up, arms half raised as though preparing for the kind of embrace that precedes forgiveness. I didn't sit down. I distributed the folders instead, moving slowly around the room, saying nothing. 1 folder to each person, watching their hands as they took them, watching their faces change. Then I stood by the fireplace, the same spot where I'd stood in 100 Christmas photos over the years, always slightly out of frame, and I let them read the cover page in silence. Patricia's face changed first, then David's. James flipped through the pages faster than the others, his jaw tightening with each one, landing on the photograph of the rental car receipt from the year his transmission failed. "Can anyone name one vacation?" I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected it to come out, where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid. Nobody answered. The room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. Can anyone remember asking whether I was healthy enough, or rested enough, or simply willing before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks at a time every single summer for 22 years? Still nothing. Marcus sat on the arm of the sofa, staring down at his own folder, and I watched something happen in his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not defensiveness. Not the reflexive loyalty to his family that I'd grown so used to. Something closer to recognition. Like he was finally seeing the machinery behind the comfort he'd taken for granted. "I'm not asking for the money back," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not interested in being repaid. I kept this because somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to trust my own sense of what was fair. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself." I looked at Patricia specifically, because I think some part of me needed her of all of them to understand. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. David cleared his throat like he might say something, but nothing came out. James closed his folder and set it on the coffee table, his ears red. Patricia sat back down slowly, the folder still open on her lap to the photograph of herself in my kitchen. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a woman preparing an argument, and more like a woman confronting an accounting she hadn't expected to face. I didn't wait for an apology that evening. I didn't think one was coming. Not yet, and I'd stopped needing it to arrive on any particular schedule. I simply gathered my things, told Marcus I'd see him at home once the paint smell cleared from the guest room, and drove myself back to the rehab apartment for one more night. The folder of my own labor sitting finally in someone else's hands instead of mine. I want you to pause here for a moment and think about something. If you have ever felt invisible in your own home, if you have ever been the person who knew where everything was kept, who solved problems before they became problems, who managed the invisible machinery of a household, while everyone around you benefited from it without ever asking what it cost, then you understand what this moment meant to Rachel. It wasn't triumph, it was being seen. Finally, I moved back into the house 11 days after I'd left it, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint instead of the usual chaos of a family visit winding down. The hallway floor gleamed under new varnish. The air conditioning hummed evenly, no more rattling. It felt oddly like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me all along, just underneath the version I'd been living in for 22 years. Marcus and I didn't have some big dramatic conversation that first night. That's not how real repair works. Not in one sweeping speech, but in 100 small adjustments made quietly over time. What we did have, a few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, was a conversation I'd been waiting half my marriage to have. "I didn't know it added up to that much," he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. "Not just the money, all of it. The driving, the meals, I didn't know because I never had to know. You always just handled it." "I know," I said, and I wasn't trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. "I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks weren't awful," he admitted, a small tired laugh escaping him. "My mother complained about hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I don't think I slept more than 5 hours a night the entire time." He looked up at me, and there was something more honest in his face than I'd seen from him in years. "But I understand now. I actually understand, Rachel. I don't think I ever really did before." We agreed that week on something we should have agreed on years earlier. No more open-door policy. No more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it whenever they wanted it. Any future visit from his family or mine, for that matter, though my side had always been smaller, quieter, easier, would require both of our agreement in advance, and would come with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries. Guests would clean up after themselves. Guests would not treat me as staff simply because I happened to know where everything was kept. The real test came about 6 weeks later at a smaller family dinner. Just Marcus's parents this time. Invited properly with 2 weeks' notice, and an explicit conversation beforehand about what the visit would look like. David arrived stiff and formal, clearly still smarting from the folder I'd handed him, and made a point of complimenting the renovated hallway in a tone that suggested he was trying very hard to find something safe to say. Patricia, for her part, brought a casserole dish, something she had never once done in 22 years of visits. She set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though placing an offering. Partway through dinner, James called Marcus's phone. He hadn't been invited this time, something Marcus and I had discussed and agreed on together. And I heard Marcus's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to hearing him use with his brother. "No, James. Not this time. We're keeping it small. You're welcome to visit, but you'll need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else." I looked up from the stove, surprised, and found Marcus watching me, checking whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded just slightly. He nodded back. Later that evening, after his parents left, David paused at the door and said gruffly, not quite looking at me, "House looks good." The floor. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was David Roberts acknowledging something out loud that he'd have once considered beneath him to notice. And I decided to let that be enough for now. It was Marcus, though, who surprised me most. A few nights later, we were in the kitchen, and I overheard him on the phone with his father. His voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This is Rachel's home, too. Actually, if we're being precise about it, it was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't. And that's on me. Not her." There was a pause, David's voice rumbling indistinctly on the other end. And then Marcus said simply, "I'm not arguing about it anymore. That's just how it's going to be." I stood in the doorway with the dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our entire marriage. And I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I'd realized. Not peace exactly, but possibility. Months passed. Autumn came, and with it the ordinary rhythms of our life. Trinity home for a long weekend. The leaves turning along our street in Houston. Those deep crimsons and golds that make you remember why you chose to stay in the South. My back finally fully healed. The brace long since packed away in a closet. Then one Tuesday evening in October, my phone rang and it was Patricia. I almost didn't answer out of old habit more than anything. But I did. And her voice when it came was different than I expected. Smaller. Almost tentative. Nothing like the commanding tone I'd known for 22 years. "Rachel," she said. "I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit? Just for the afternoon. I'd call ahead, of course. And bring something for lunch if that's all right with you." I smiled, standing alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. It wasn't an apology. Linda Roberts. Patricia Roberts. I kept mixing up names sometimes. Even now I suspected would never quite manage the words themselves. But it was something I'd waited 22 years to hear. A woman who had once treated my home as a birthright, now asking gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. "Saturday would be lovely, Patricia," I said. "I'll see you then. And here's what I need you to understand about this story, about what it actually means." The moment Rachel stopped explaining herself and started showing the math, everything changed. Not because she was cruel, not because she was punishing anyone, but because sometimes the only language people understand is evidence. Sometimes you have to make the invisible visible in a way that cannot be argued with, denied, or explained away. If you have ever stayed silent when you should have spoken, if you have ever absorbed someone else's expectations and called it love, if you have ever wondered whether your exhaustion was justified or just weakness, this story is for you. You're not weak for being tired. You're not selfish for having limits. You're not dramatic for needing to be seen. Here's what I want to know. Do you think Rachel was right to do what she did? Comment 1 if you think she had every right to protect her recovery. Comment 2 if you think she should have tried to talk to Marcus first. Comment 3 if you think the family deserved to understand the full scope of what she'd been doing. I read every single comment. I genuinely do. And I'd love to know, what city are you watching from right now? What time is it there? And most importantly, have you ever been in a situation where you had to make your own labor visible to the people you loved? Drop a comment and let me know. We have new stories just like this one waiting for you every single day. Stories about people who found their voice. People who set boundaries. People who finally decided that being seen mattered more than being liked. So subscribe right now so you never miss a moment like this one. Hit that bell so you get notified the moment a new story goes live. Let's keep this journey going together. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.